Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. I'm really happy in this episode to be joined, and we're laughing off air here, and I want to say the title. It's the Chief Movement Officer at Movement Mojo, Rob Francis. So I know it's a wee bit of tongue-in-cheek, Rob, but actually it's really poignant as a way of just introducing you and what you care about. And we're going to be talking today, actually, about a topic that I think is overlooked and I think a lot of times just assumed to happen implicitly through just, the training of sports drills lends itself naturally to movement skills, but does it? And I think, maybe you can kick it off for us, Rob. I'm just going to ask that question. Does it relate to it just absolutely naturally? I want to know why you got into doing what you do, and maybe that will help us start off chatting about this topic a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. So my background is a S&C coach. I then spent a little bit of time in sports rehab. So I did a rehab master's as well. So really trying to get a real understanding of exercise prescription and skill acquisition principles at different stages. And I was really passionate about that. So I looked at rehab stage when someone's injured and went through to the S&C stage as more of a performance stage, just to get a full understanding of the process. I worked in governing bodies as an S&C, and part of my role then transpired in a governing body where we worked on a project to increase the provision of strength and conditioning across our pathway across the UK. And it began to be a train-the-trainer model, training skills coaches to have skill acquisition principles, S&C knowledge and exercise prescription knowledge to not just increase the technical and tactical, but also the physical side. And then I found a real gap there of sports coaches know the sport, know the rules, but very rarely we touch on the physical side behind it. And I went and then did this role as well for the IOC, educating skills coaches in the Pacific and mentoring them around S&C input into their tactical sessions and what they can do to develop athletes physically. And then I brought that back to the UK and founded Movement Mojo, where we go into clubs, local authorities and schools, and we educate sports coaches and instructors on skill acquisition principles and adaptions, mainly around people with disabilities and chronic health conditions, but all this stuff is applicable to any population, as you're aware.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I mean, that's a wide array of levels and environments there that you've just given us. And I suppose straight away, and this is the thing, isn't it? When you're speaking to coaches, as soon as you see S&C in terms of we're talking about still coaches, then it becomes, well, right, what is it? Is it about, that separate work, or is it about, how you might help in the back of what we do? But this is more about blending it together, isn't it? This is like, coaches, and it's strange as well, because I wonder if you maybe give me your perspective on just the how much appetite there's been so much in so far as the modern sports coach towards integrating S&C training within their sort of repertoire. Because I think nowadays coaches see the need to think like a psychologist somewhat. They see the need to think with a little bit maybe of a mind towards nutrition. But again, because it's often so well catered for in some sense, the S&C side of it through separate staff or, certainly within like performance contests, there hasn't always been that real push or need as a skill coach to think towards like, actually, I really need you better at this and understanding this stuff at a deeper level. Where have you found, in what ways rather, have you found that being ignorant of some of the knowledge that an S&C coach can have and actually think how you can apply it, and what is a real interdisciplinary role that the sports coach have? What are the pitfalls of having that ignorance, perhaps, when we're talking about movement skill and how that translates perhaps into technical skill, even tactical skill you mentioned in the past? So maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think it's like if we drill invasion-based sports, let's go back to the bare basics of it. It's they all have the same kind of gross and fine motor skills, don't they? The ability to kind of cut, change direction, attack, defend, jump maybe, lunge maybe. Sports are just rules of combined gross and fine motor skills, realistically, put in a very kind of rigid environment and a format, and then it becomes a sport, realistically. But if we look at the underpinning of invasion, the same kind of characteristics are seen in rugby, netball, football, very, very similar in their approaches, right? So when we are a sports coach, we often get caught up in like the rules of the sport and the format of a sport, and actually forget to strip back what are the underpinning skills required within this sport. Being an S&C, it's almost S&C is a kind of the skill acquisition experts within that area, because all you're taught is, how do I put this person in the best possible physical position to execute their skill? So you have a real high understanding of all these different motor skills and fundamental skills required for said movement, for example. So the added value of looking through an S&C lens is looking at what are the skills required, how do we develop those skills required from a physical standpoint to actually go into that sport. And I think having an S&C on your team, if you are in that performance environment where you've got the interdisciplinary approach, is really vital to look through their lens and work in collaboration with them to add that value to the development of the athlete that you are coaching.
Yeah, I remember even we were chatting just before we came on air as well. Like I was giving that example of, that kid that's playing football, for example, and I'm trying to coach them on how to make a better cross, but even at the same time, but their decision making of when to make it, who to pass to. At the crux of that, if they can't balance on one foot, they can't cross the ball. And again, well, what's the solution from a still learning perspective? They'll just continue to repeat the attempt at the cross. Just that isn't really helping understand there's proprioceptal work there. There's other aspects of what's going on there, because again, you're and it's not necessarily, this isn't, I don't think, the fault of the coach, but it's more exposing that there's always going to be a deficiency unless you look outwards across all the landscapes of disciplines, and S&C is one of them. But we don't often get taught first how does coordination work. We don't get taught about like degrees of freedom. We don't get taught about like how we actually coordinate movement. We don't get taught about that. We get taught about the rules of the game. We get taught about content we can put together. And then it's like, right, we challenge our athletes on that point. But if they don't have this underpinning idea of ways in which we coordinate movement, ways in which we're better at movement, you're going to probably reach the same issues that you would love to avoid. You're probably going to hit your head against the wall with some players. But again, how much are you preparing the players to actually function in a movement space in the first place, isn't it? So what's your solution? How does a coach, right, we've now established we need to know more about it. What's your experience been at how you actually work with coaches? What do we focus on in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love kind of the story that you told behind that. I think it's really poignant. I mean, yesterday, for example, like we worked with a school which is very much a sport first approach to PE and athletic development, let's say. But often what we see is kids will learn the rules of the game, but they won't learn necessarily the physical skills required. So this was like, we saw an under-9s game which they were playing, and it was the kids were just chasing the ball like a cross-country race. And every single time they put a ball in, the kids just lost their actual principles of invasion, which is obviously attack space, defend space. The moment we drummed it down and went, let's go from a skills-first approach, what skill are we trying to learn? Creating space, defending space. Let's play a game of TIG, or let's play a game of Bulldog. Let's get them actually hitting the lesson objective or the session objective from that skills-first approach rather than a sport-first approach. We saw the same recently last weekend. For example, we went into a tennis lesson, and the lesson objective was actually returning the ball. But the children couldn't return the ball. It was one-sided. It was more of a 10, not the miss, so to speak, where the ball would come over the net and the kids wouldn't return it. But the moment we went in and said, what's the skill they're learning? Returning the ball. Okay, let's create an environment that does just that. So we came out with a solution where we played like a squash variant to it. It wasn't tennis, but it was more like a squash, but they were learning the skills required. We often see that within long-term athletic development, where kids will understand the rules of the game, the rules of the sport, but in terms of like things outside of that, like the physical, the motor skill, and sometimes like the foundational movements required, like you were alluding to, being able to cross, but not optimally because a single leg balance has a deficit. So that's where, as an S&C, you have that lens. And I think that's where sports coaches could really look at increasing their value and their impact, either embedding a strength and conditioning or sports science professional within their area, or even themselves, like looking at different CPD they can do within motor learning principles. I know you mentioned there, leaning on different motor learning strategies such as task constraints, environmental strengths, in individual constraints-based approaches. Those are things where I think sports coaches can really increase their value. I think we're very good at understanding the rules of the game, the formats, the different sessions that we put on, I think are really creative. But I think it's those, what actually builds that skill up and builds that person to do that skill, for example.
And why, Rob, would you say then and it's whether or not I'm understanding that correctly, but why would you say then that we take away the sport-specific element and have more of a skill-based component that seems to be a bit more generic, or has more transferred value, perhaps? Just as you speak there, it's reminding me of the sort of in coaching circles, we might call that like a TGFU approach, so teaching gains for understanding, where there's almost like a transferred value between different sports, where they still fit within the same category. So you mentioned like invasion sports, and I just wonder if that's deliberate, because it's like there's commonalities across those sports, and that's often under this sort of assumption that we can learn these movement skills in a way that lends themselves better to other format variants of that same overarching activity.
So I think complexity doesn't always mean better outcome. I think we often make environments so chaotic when we start going sport first approach that we start missing actually the things that we're trying to develop, such as the example I gave. As soon as I put ball in, the kids started chasing the ball. Yeah, they were scoring goals left, right and centre, but they're all clumping together, no spatial awareness. The lesson objective was spatial awareness, attacking space, defending space. So we often go sport first and create way too much chaos that we fail to hit the outcomes. And we're always looking at progressing that, I think, way too quickly. Simplistic approaches work a lot better, but I think we often think simplistic is boring. You can still gamify these fundamentals and still kids can have fun and engagement within this. I think often when we go through that sport first with that chaotic approach too, the kids lose that ability to self-explore and actually develop themselves and get the outcome that we're looking for, you see. So I think having more of that fundamental approach, especially at a young age, is going to reap the rewards as they go through maturation and get higher within the game or the sport, so to speak.
And does the chaos that you're implying, is that coming in the form of the fact that an individual or a sport in itself has got lots of different or at least it's got lots of nuances in terms of the technical, let's say football, just for simplicity, like the fact that you have to manipulate the ball, but there's rules and ways that you aren't allowed to manipulate the ball. You can't pick up the ball. There's team, there's other form. Is that the part that you would consider to be it adds too much of a burden on the sport and the rules and just being within that sport, rather than actually maybe focusing on the movement potentials that you're trying to train, just more generally speaking? Is that the chaos that you refer to?
Yeah, and I think when we look at these chaos, it's a multitude of different factors of variables which affect the person or the persons within the game. The moment we apply a task constraint or environment constraint or some form of constraint, we actually eradicate those factors, so we get a more tunneled guided approach. Such as the moment we took the ball away and we started doing a game of TIG, progressing it to like Bulldog, we got rid of the fact that the kids wanted to chase the ball, and all of a sudden they had to find their space and find their way to the space. Then we can start putting a ball in and play like a more zonal game towards that as a progression. We've gone skill first rather than layering sport on, creating way too much chaos for the actual training age of the athlete, so to speak, and their experiences. And I think that's really key. Constraints-led approaches, I believe, are the future of sports coaches, because it is like the number one skill acquisition principle that we use, and a multitude of abilities, because it's enabling the player or the athlete to self-discover their own outcomes without us autocratically going in there. So without us autocratically going in there and, the old-fashioned moving the player in the bib and getting them all on the line, moving backwards and forwards, you have to be there, you have to be there. It's almost, let's play a game of TIG and they self-discover their own ways. Let's progress it out to Bulldog. Okay, let's put zonal constraints in where they can play now with the ball, but it's very zonal. But within that environment, the athletes have still self-discovered their own outcome. Player-led, player exploration, but purely through different constraints that we've put on the game to minimize how much chaos and interference is actually happening.
Do you know what's quite unique about that? And tell me if that is unique, because that's true. It's a surprising methodology, just based on, at least in this, I'm going to speak from a position of ignorance, but it's a surprising methodology because I think, and I'm going to talk like that average sports coach, we typically view, because an S&C coach, or at least the way we would classically perceive them, would be it's very posture guided. It's almost like still the motor learning is postural. So that normally starts to bring in thoughts of quite decoupled, decontextualized, very modularized training formats, where I've just said that, I've given an example there, and this is just, I'm a daft I'm just thinking about this, but I'm doing that example there, the kid that maybe can't cross the ball right because they lose balance. So my first thought, all right, do we get that kid balancing on a wobble board? Because that's how coaches would think of S&C and its role to help. But actually what you're actually suggesting is that we're not decoupling it. So that functional, that representative practice can still be there, but it's doing it in a way that it's just what we're accentuating is more the movement mechanics and the movement potential, isn't it? It's not necessarily removing them from an environment where they can't still concurrently learn movement skills at the same time as learning tactical skills, or even the technical skills to some degree too. Is that is your way of doing that? Is that a new way of doing it then? Because that sounds very modern and sounds far more integrated with a skill coach approach.
So I just I'm so passionate listening to you because I think S&C gets butchered very much like coaching gets butchered. When people think of S&C, they think of like a CrossFit class or a High class or very much like burpee sit-ups on every line and back, right?
Yeah.
But it's almost like when you say a coach to the general population, they think of an 18, 19-year-old on a kids camp standing there with a whistle. There's a very big difference between what S&C looks at a performance lens, like if you're in an SPL club, right, compared to probably what happens on a Saturday morning kids pitch, right, for example. Like there's a big difference. I'm talking purely what like I've been exposed to, like, obviously my master's degree and exposure in NGBs of what S&C should really look like, I suppose, like yourselves, with how actual coaching should look like. How that's done on the ground on a mass scale within the community looks very different to that realistically. But this is obviously my philosophy, the philosophy that I've developed in NGBs. And I got to this point because I worked in very skill-based sports. So I worked in cricket with like fast bowlers for a little bit. Then I went to work in archery. And archery was almost like an opportunity to really hone in on what skill acquisition is from an S&C perspective. And then I've really taken that in my stride and built upon that. So 100% to what you're saying, it should be integrated. It shouldn't look like night and day. The S&C should be embedded and integrated. Of how, I think the thing what I got from archery was, how can we facilitate the technical execution of the arrow being shot from a physical and motor standpoint? That was my philosophy working with like Olympic and Paralympic pathway archers who were, one went to the games this year, for example, from our pathway. It wasn't getting them like to load up 100 kilos on the bench press or do squats or, stuff like that. I mean, that's all added in. But the main point was, how do we facilitate this very fine motor skill and embed it into the training?
And how does it, and I'm just wondering, is there a distinction in the way you think about the physical execution of executing that skill in archery versus the coach's approach, which is the technical execution? Because there's different connotations attached to that. But again, is this not maybe an opportunity for us to see how they converge more than they diverge? It's just maybe leading with one view of things, maybe in the sort of the physical execution that actually may assist with the technical. So can you how do you differentiate that? What's the physical and what's the technical execution?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a differentiation, but then we come together. We call it like interdisciplinary rather than multidisciplinary. So like IDT is basically everyone's expertise is respected, but we can all comment. But it's only the person who's the expert in their area that can execute it. And that's how we work. I'm never going to be an archery coach. I've not got 40 years, 50 years of learning within that environment to understand it. I still don't understand a lot of the shot mechanics. I understand it from the area that I need to know about, and that's how we would talk. So the coach would offer the technical support of technically what are they looking for in the shot process from a technical lens? How do I make that happen physically from a physical standpoint? What motor and skill acquisition principles does the coach need to involve? Is it a motor element of actually they just need to run through different constraints to actually learn it from a motor standpoint? Or is it a strength standpoint? Do we need to get the archer loaded up in the gym a little bit more so they actually have the strength to do that movement, for example, or the stability to do that movement? And that's where we kind of work on that interdisciplinary approach. Physically, there's lots of factors. It's not just having big muscles or, big tendons, for example. There's also that motor connection, which is mind to muscle connection. And from an S&C point, you're always looking at, is this a motor element where we need to put motor drills in place, such as, constraining the task, using some different external cues, using some like mirrors, external, feedback loops? Or is this a strength issue where we need to get them stronger in the gym to execute this, for example? And I think that's where the conversation comes in. It's a really multi-dimensional conversation. There's so many variables, but that's just purely examples of how S&C was embedded and integrated within a very skill-based sport.
Yeah, I know. It's fascinating, and it's making me think like now about. I talk about the technical execution of kicking a ball. But let's say again, I've got a wee kid at 9, and I'm asking him to kick a ball 50 yards. I can get the technical execution to a point, but if the physical execution of that in terms of their capacity to generate the power to kick the ball, obviously that's also constrained by maturation and other, what would you call it, involuntary factors there. But even just in understanding that, at the very least, it offers it more of a diagnostic, capacity there that if, again, as a coach, I want to be able to judge an athlete fairly. I think it really does lend itself that I need to understand the physical functioning behind what I'm asking them to do in order to go alongside my appraisal of the technical, execution and performance of that movement. So, I see it actually more just, I think coaching is about conversations, and I think coaches need to arm themselves with as much information as they can do in order to have the best conversations with their athletes. And I just think that's where it would be absolutely jeopardising the quality of those conversations if we weren't cognizant of these mechanical factors. Because again, I think it's true as far as I've got to, within some sports. Football's a sport that when I run a coach ed course or if I do anything, we tell them all the time about small-sided games so they'll run about more, and that's good for endurance, and that's as far as it goes kind of thing, because it's like, after that point it becomes, going to an S&C coach. But how do we actually go about that? Can we understand the rationale now? We get that this is important. We get that fundamentals are happening. Is your work? Is there any constraint in terms of resource? Can an amateur kids coach who doesn't have any outside training, doesn't have access to an S&C coach, can they still plan and deliver sessions in a way that would still get them at least still good outcomes that's maybe not necessarily comparable to coaches in academies or coaches in really performance centered spaces where they have that resource? How do you make up for lack of resource sometimes or lack of background and time? What are some pick up and use strategies you might be able to give us, Ross, that we should start doing right away?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Do you know of any NGB with like a level 2 in physical prep or something like that, maybe? Like, yeah, is there anything?
From my own experience, certainly I know within football we do that physical preparation for kids. I actually think what's quite a cool model, I've seen a lot of fundamental movements within British canoeing. It's quite interesting as a space because they have, within their sort of longer term athlete development, they have quite a deliberate view towards the physical development of skills. It's sort of like, a movement literacy and how they sort of conceptualise it in that space. So I've seen a lot of that stuff, but oftentimes, it takes you to a YouTube link and then you see kids doing crab walks and stuff like that, which is fun. Maybe what's your thoughts on that?
I think this is a missing link, right? So you could do an NGB course like that and learn the fundamental movements and understand the bare bones of skill acquisition, but then you've ultimately got to piece it together into game scenarios, right? There seems to be not that missing link because no kid wants to run every line and back. That's why we have small-sided games, right? Yeah, it's like, how do you embed those fundamentals within your 1 hour, 90-minute set or 90-minute session on the park where you've got 15, 10-year-olds who want to play games, for example? And how do you gamify it? What's your rules of gamification? Yeah, that's almost something that I've come up with myself just through exposure and experiences. Yeah, and I think that's where S&C gets like math or fundamental movements or physical literacy gets really lost. We often think of it as very boring, very dry. It doesn't have to be. I think a skills-first based approach is key, but almost when we deliver it in game-based or gamify it in different scenarios, for example.
Yeah, and I could imagine there is a bit of tension, isn't it? Because part of the reason why kids turn up is they do love a sport. More often than not, you go into work with kids, there's a sport that they enjoy. But I wonder, and I don't know how much you align your work with sort of Whitehead's sort of conception of physical literacy that does seem to go beyond physical movement. There's also considering motivation, confidence.
Yep.
That's
Exactly.
important. And it's like, if you, and again, how do we create spaces where if we want motivation, we want people to enjoy and want them to come back. Sometimes playing the sport itself, it could be hazardous to that, because then all of a sudden they attach their success towards rather bounded rules and rather, whereas you take the ball away, you take away the rules of the football just for a little moment, you might be able to create a space where there's more success, there's more enjoyment, there's more motivation, so that you're then, you're facilitating that this desire for lifelong participation in sport, or at least you're getting them close. You're not necessarily going to guarantee people are going to stay there forever, and you can't do, I would imagine it'd be a bit foolish as well to do only, movement-based stuff. You still need to have the game, you have to have the sport, but does that play a role in it? That, so, thinking about that wider conception of what helps people want to be physically active and move and learn and play skillful activities.
I think everything has to be a game. If it's not a game, it's not enjoyable, is it, right? And I think we often get distracted what a game actually is. I think you have to have win and lose scenarios, but you have to define what winning is around, does it represent learning the skill? Is that how they win the game? And I think everyone does love games. Like I've played like cones and domes with like Olympic athletes, for example, like, but a task constraint on that they can only hop up and down, whilst moving around, or they do the noughts and crosses, but we'll do like a bounding jump when we're trying to increase their plyometric ability, for example. Like, everything has to be game, fun, scenario based. And I think sometimes with this skill acquisition stuff and fundamental movement stuff is we just think of real crap games, when we look at a game, I think, it's what the individual wants. There has to be a competition and win. There has to be a visualization element. There has to be a target. There almost has to be a story behind that game, So I think that's going to be, that's a real key point.
And are you trying to almost mask the formal learning process in that? Because I mean, some people don't like S&C gym sessions, but
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's almost masking it, but also trying to like get it as close to the end product as possible, so try and like not have a night and day divide between it, and that's where small-sided games come in. What's a small-sided game? Developing aerobic capacity, but with a ball, players, one, it masks the ability, but also you get in all the other corners in there: psychological development, social development, as well as physical and tactical, right? And that's almost where sprint-based games come in as well, to get high-speed meters to develop, like, hamstring robustness and top-end speed. And, even those games where they run in, like 1 versus 1, 2 versus 2 scenarios sprinting in, they're working on other attributes, but we're getting a byproduct of that physical development too. So I think it's a two-sided coin to that,
Yeah, and it makes me think a lot, because I always believe that when you've got a bunch of experts, right, and you give them a timetable or a schedule where the S&C coach has got an hour, the sports coach has got an hour, the psychologist has got an hour. Like, it doesn't need to, in a optimized environment, each of them have got 3 hours, because each of them are building upon what each of them are doing in different ways. And it kind of is like the S&C component of movement, of still learning, but the S&C component anyway of that training environment doesn't need to end at the end of the gym session. The coach can continue that work. And it's just about how, in the same way I think coaches could be pulling from psychology as well, and they can continue that work. That helps maximise the effectiveness of all staff, and it just through the fact that it's also maximising the contact time and the training time, it's ultimately maximising the outcomes for the players. So that in itself is, in my opinion, that's the view I think that why coaches need to start to consider this sort of stuff, because they can just maximise the help that they're giving one another across a team.
I totally agree. It's like S&C, there is a gym component, which is the traditional route, right? But we're talking about like the more nuanced, different areas, right? And I think 100% agree, it doesn't end in the gym. I think like what I learned from working in a real high skill sport is just standing on the line and just being there from a coach's standpoint of how can I support the technical coaches with this? Like, how are they shooting? What's the coach working on? Does it need my input around motor strategies? Does it need my input around, we might need to do this in the gym, for example? And I think it 100% works in every sport. You know, I've got friends who work in football, and they're on the side with the GPS unit saying, is this small-sided game actually developing aerobic properties, or is it too high intense? Do we need to make it smaller? Or is this high-speed running game actually hitting the meters required to develop, you know, hamstring robustness and high-speed, you know, meters? So it is having that input from all times. Because I think we often forget sport isn't one-dimensional. It's made up of a multitude of factors. And I think don't get lost on the technical, tactical. Understand that there is that physical component that isn't just the gym, isn't just for heart and lungs. It's also how people acquire those skills that you're wanting them to do.
How does it change for, just you mentioned as well about inclusive activity, how does it change for, and I'd actually maybe before I actually presume what you mean by that, what do you mean by inclusive activity? Because I know we could talk about working with disabilities, but inclusivity is actually quite sometimes it's too narrowly defined in that space. But what do you mean when you say inclusive practice, and how we might use your sort of the Go Mojo approach around that?
Yeah, so I think inclusive is a really broad term, and we went inclusive mainly because I think inclusive from a physical standpoint doesn't just necessarily mean people with disabilities and chronic health conditions. It also means people who, I mean, we're living in a generation now where kids aren't getting exposed to gross motor skills at a young age. They're not going out to roll around, climb a tree, or run in the park. So actually entering into, you know, sport with a massive deficit. And you'll see it at 7, 6 years old, where a kid can't do any of those fundamental movements like crawl, roll, catch. You see it all the time. We hear it from PE teachers where kids can't throw a ball above their head these days. It goes side and kind of goes behind them. Like, we're seeing massive deficits. So creating an inclusive coaching environment is to cater for a multitude of different skills and also different needs. And I think this is where the whole coaching landscape changes. Because, like I said, on a lot of these governing bodies, well, most of them, they teach the sport, the rules of the sport. Even on their disability coaching badges, it's the format of the sport for the disability, not how do I actually coach that motor impairment or that specific need or that person at that skill level. What happens if they can't kick a ball? What happens if they can't catch a ball? And I think that's where the real deep understanding of skill acquisition principles come from, and why I found Movement Mojo. Like, I was working in a multitude of sport. Like I said, I've lent heavily on archery, but I spent a lot of time in women's beach volleyball, and I worked across the Pacific and across quite a lot of the world with that one. And we saw a massive gap in skill acquisition principles across the whole sport. So it's going to be an interesting one how the landscape of coaching changes, because I know we've lent heavily on coaching degrees and courses on pedagogical approaches, different games scenarios, different sport rules, but how do we start now being inclusive to the population changing and seeing a multitude of people coming through the door that we've now got a coach?
So what would that, how does it, I mean, it seems to suggest almost there's a degree of individuality there for then when you're facilitating sort of game-based movement activities, you know, game-based movement still, you know, training. How do we blend that then with, right, so we've established now we want coaches to gamify things. We want them to focus sometimes on the movement still rather than the sports still. Where does the movement still emphasis allow for a degree of individuality when we're talking about impairments, or not necessarily impairment, but impairments in itself, that could be an injured athlete. Impairments itself could be an athlete with a certain disability. It could be an athlete, to be honest, I don't know, shyness. That's, you know, depends on how we're conceiving of this stuff, but where does individuality come into that then? Is it allows more choice because now the rules, the sport rules that are really bounded, we're getting rid of them a little bit for a brief moment, and at least what do you...
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's such a variable scenario, right? And I think once you understand skill acquisition, the principles, and come from a skill first approach, you can put individual constraints on people. And constraint not as in a negative, it's training the person, not the disability, or training the person, not necessarily the sport or the skill, person-centered. But you look at kind of what they can do, what's affecting their performance to get that outcome, and you constrain those factors. I'll talk about it from a sensory need standpoint. For example, a player with high needs within autism might not let someone come into their space or feel comfortable with them coming into their space in an invasion-based game. Are we looking at that from inclusive by name or inclusive by nature? Because most coaches would put that person as the goalkeeper or that person on the side, on the outside. But are they getting the same lesson and same session outcome of understanding invasion principles and spatial awareness as the rest of the group? They're not within those positions. So how do you create an environment that they can do that? It might be putting a bib on the person where all players are aware that they can't get within 1 meter of the bibbed player, for example, and they act as a neutral player who can play to both sides. They can then play in the middle, have that spatial awareness, scanning, still getting through the same lesson outcomes, but in their own safe space. It might be creating different zones, safe zones within the pitch, where that certain player can move from safe zone to safe zone. None of the players can enter those different little circles you have on the pitch, for example. But now they're included by nature, not included by name. That's how you bring individuality to the table. And that's how, if we're thinking from a skill-first approach, the lesson outcome or the session outcome is invasion principles. We have a player here who has high levels of autism, who doesn't like people getting their space. How do we create that inclusive environment for them to get that same outcome without that interference within them?
So obviously then it can't, I mean, there's going to be a limit to how far they things can go before it starts to eventually impede their skill-based development. But you would probably argue that we need to be comfortable with sitting in the space that individual perhaps needs for as long as they need it, until maybe such time as it through exposure to these environments that maybe we can then coach them out of, maybe, I don't know, towards more skill-based. And I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, potentially. I don't think we can. I think it's individual, isn't it? Like potentially, you know. But I think it's how. But the same principles could be applied with like a physical impairment, or let's say an injured player. Instead of having them on the outside or as a goalkeeper, you might have them in zonal patches on the pitch if they're recovering from a hamstring tear and they can't, sprint up and down. For example, you won't have them as a goalkeeper on the side. Sorry, you have them on zonal based, or they might have a bib where they can't get tackled and contact. But you've integrated the same player into that same session, and they've got the same learning outcome as all the other players, for example. It's looking at it through that lens where we're looking at it from a skill-first approach. Then we constrain any external factors that might affect the adherence of that learning to get that skill, and making sure that all the players on the pitch attain that learning outcome. When we go sport first, we often miss out that because, like you said, so many variable factors, so much chaos, very linear in its natured approach, realistically.
But I suppose if we do look at it through that sort of ecological lens, we talk about constraint-based coaching. I mean, for every constraint, there has to be an affordance. There has to be, ideally there should be anyway. You can't give a problem without a solution, otherwise you're just leading someone into a brick wall. Oftentimes, probably, if they're not deliberate and if we're not looking at things through a inclusive lens and focusing, I suppose, on how we can push an athlete towards outcomes, a still first practice oftentimes does have a lot of problems, but the affordances haven't been individualised. The affordances have been catered to a group level, so that in some respects prohibits everyone from achieving, and you aren't going to achieve the same outcome, but it avoids everyone having the same opportunity to achieve outcomes, and that isn't always great. So yeah.
I think we're looking at like not equality, but it's more like equity, I would say.
Yeah, that should it. Yeah,
equity in like participation rather than equality of outcome. For example, it's more everyone has equity in the process. Not everyone's going to achieve the same outcome because, like you said, what happens to the sensory need participant with autism, for example, who doesn't like the space getting closed? There's going to be a level that might reach potentially, for example, and that impede any further progress. But it's the equity of the opportunity to take part within that development, which is, I think, really key for coaches in 2024.
Yeah. And it would be naive for me to suggest then that this is purely something that can operate on a grassroots level and only a grassroots level, because that isn't necessarily the case, is it not? I know you could find it easier to integrate things where you have the lay of the land and there isn't any forced confinement or conformment to the sport. But you've given examples in archery and these things where it was in a performance context, and you looked at the person first.
Yeah, I think you can flip it to a rehab standpoint. You've got a player coming back from rehab. How do you integrate them in the game rather than just running by the side of the pitch? What constraints can you put on the game or constraints on the player that enables them to take part within their environment that's going to integrate them in to practice, so to speak?
this sort of movement revolution is this sort of movement first approach to sports coaching and segments. I would probably push back in some sense of saying that, the still matters as well, but I suppose it's just that, and I don't believe you're saying that it doesn't either. It's just that it's that getting that harmony correct between how movement and affects the still and vice versa. Can this apply to working with older athletes? Can it apply? I mean, I'm thinking about, we have like masters level athletes as well. Can we only train, because there's that idea, I think when we think movement still, we think physical literacy. And I think there's almost that rush to seeing there being an end to physical literacy. I think this is where Whitehead's conceptualization is quite helpful. And also I think there was some work I've seen previously around the different worlds that people inhabit in their sort of journey in exercise and physical activity and through sport, where we move up towards competitive environments, we move back towards recreation. We do on different sort of loops and turns where we're a beginner in one sport, we're an expert in another. How does that feed in thinking longer term? How does the stuff like the Movement Mojo, but the underpinning philosophy of a movement still approach to designing practices, how does that lend itself to all ages and of participant?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. It never ends. And I know that Whitehead kind of talks about confidence, motivation, like the physical side from a very, maturation, standpoint, how to develop people for physical literacy for life model almost, right? But yeah, it carries on through the whole of our life. We're always acquiring new skills, right? I can talk about it from like a cricket experience with a fast bowler. We had an athlete towards their end of their career, and they'd been bowling a certain way for their whole career, but it was really impacting them from a loading perspective. I don't agree there's always an optimal way to do a skill. We all move differently, so it's understanding there's high degrees of variability. But this athlete had certain injuries that really started to impede the way how he was executing his fast bowling technique. So we had to spend a whole winter block looking at how do we get him from a skill acquisition point bowling in a more effective, efficient manner that isn't going to lead to any more overuse injuries within the area that he was injured. So we spent a whole 6 months going through skill acquisition principles, motor learning, constraints-based approaches, all these different things in the nets, so that when he could hit the season in the summer, he was bowling more efficiently from the time where he's at based on his injury history. So it's applicable throughout because things change, right? I don't think there's an optimal way to kick a ball. There's not an optimal way to sprint. We have various degrees of variability. Usain Bolt, everyone comments on his start. If he wasn't running the time he's at, and let's say he's an amateur running 10.5, everyone would be like, the start's the reason why you're not Olympic champion, right? There's in terms of form and skill, there's not a right way to do something. I think everyone has their optimal way of executing it, and there's lots of degrees of variability. Sometimes, especially with masters athletes, things might come up. It might be them getting injured and they have to load in a different way, for example. I saw a lot with Paralympic athletes when I was at archery. Certain para athletes have conditions that get worse over time. So you'd start off with a certain technique, for example, for them shooting with their arms, but then it might move to them having to use their teeth to draw the bow, you see. So how do we then get them to acquire that skill of drawing effectively with their teeth? How do we get them in that very set position to do that? So I think it's applicable for everyone from birth all the way up, realistically.
It's really cool. Do you know what you're thinking? You're making me think about, I mean, it's sometimes the still informs the movement, and sometimes the movement informs the still. Look at Andy Murray's career trajectory, right? So if you think about Andy Murray as a young kid, okay, as he moved through the ranks in tennis, he essentially, the stills and the execution, the technical execution of his shot had to change because he was going up against better players. The margin for error was getting smaller and smaller. So that in that context, the still world is informed the way he has to move in order to cope with that. Then Andy Murray gets older. Andy Murray gets hip replacement surgery. Andy Murray's bodily movement has to inform the still because Andy Murray has changed as an athlete. So again, if we were coaches and we always had a still first approach to coaching Andy Murray, you would only be able to coach him for half of his career.
Yeah.
Whereas that second half, we need to take a movement first approach to coaching Andy Murray's still. That's quite, I think when you frame it in that way, it's where I'm just trying to see in terms of how you said that it becomes easier for me to understand that now, because I'm seeing it as that trajectory of movement and still, and how they morph together, and where one has to take precedent over the other, not in a way that's dominating, but in a way that's assisting the overall, strategy and the unison between those things. That's that fairly reflective, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a multitude of factors, and I think we're just bringing to light like the motor skill requirement, the physical requirement, rather than the technical, tactical element, isn't there? There's no one-sided approach. I think it's multitude. We're all even, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's more bringing awareness to that other side, which until we talk about it, we don't realize it, do we? Realistically,
yeah. Could have Andy Murray tries to serve the same way when he was 18 to when he was 35? He can't do it. His body won't be able to do it. So he's had to start from the mechanical aspect of his body and bring backwards towards the still aspect.
And I think what's really important is not one of those ways is technically wrong. They're both right approaches, but it's contextualizing when that is. And I think often we get caught up of people should move like X and Y, but within chaotic environments, there's multiple ways of doing it, especially with like, I go back to archery again, because we're talking about skill acquisition. It's got to be one of the most acquired skill sports that I've worked. It's like taking a penalty kick as a sport, right? It's that very fine skill where everyone on the line was shooting with a variance in technique, yet they were all hitting the target 90 odd meters down the range, for example, but they all had a high variance in technique. So there's not one purely technical model that works for all of them. They all had degrees of affordance behind that. And I think that's the same with what we're talking about, right? It's like skill acquisition principles matter through the ages, and no matter what level you are, there's no right or wrong approach of how that should look, for example.
Yeah, and again, I even think, again, come to football as well, like, you look at Peter Crouch when he went up to head of the ball. If I headed the ball, I could still achieve a header, but the loading on my body and how I do that, it's an entirely different mechanical process for achieving the same still movement. So again, it's like we need to maybe work out of the mechanics of the movement before we then refine the still maybe again. And it's just a really interesting, what I think you're bringing with it. And I must admit, like, it's still, when you're a coach, it's still a difficult thing to understand when you get into the really granular levels of it. I think the very fact of having a conversation where we are just reversing things and you're forcing me to think about the movement first, and that in itself is just bringing with it a whole other train of thought and moves in a direction that's slightly different. Not in a direction that completely goes in separate routes, but just a slight different lane, and it's just helping you, guide you towards the same destination, but in a different way, in a way that it maybe, has less bumps, but maybe in a way that, has utility. And I think that's just really powerful.
Yes. I think just saying, like, how you were saying how Peter Crouch moves compared to yourself, right? It's that player-centered approach. How you talk about it from a pedagogical standpoint, where it's like, how do you communicate to that player? Like, every player, has different styles of communication. They're going to react differently to each one, right? It's almost like that. Like, they're all going to move in their own individual way. And almost like, just because X player does it, doesn't mean it's a causation correlation to mean that everyone should move like that, for example. We often, and I've got caught up in this when I've worked in sport, because a player has made it, everyone has that causation correlation to think that's the thing which has done it for them, not, that's their own individual way. It probably won't work for anyone else, so to speak,
No, I completely agree. What do you think then? Does a coach then need to go, because part of upskilling, there's an investment in upskilling and I think what we've been able to chart out, and I don't think there's a lot, like coaches learn about constraints, but I do feel the sort of motor learning side, when it gets really, really granular, it does lend itself, it's not accessible very freely. So coaches would, do coaches need to go and enroll in a degree to go and do this stuff? Or I think, your model seems to be about, gamifying it, and that doesn't seem to be inaccessible. That seems to be quite direct, quite quick. I just wonder, is there anything you can add to that alongside, the fact that we can gamify, the fact that we can remove the salient factor being skill first, that we can make the salient factor being the movement aspect. Is that enough? Is there anything else that you think allow a coach to pick up and use some of these defining principles of Move Mojo that maybe we haven't already covered? I think they are very clear on themselves. I just want to see how we can maximise this conversation for those that are listening, because I think at this point people are going, I can do this, but they're still going, do I need to know as much as Rob knows? And that's the hard part sometimes about engaging with a new way of thinking.
I mean, there is always that green lumber fallacy behind it, or being a mechanic who knows the engine parts and not knowing how to assemble an engine or do an MOT. Almost you don't need to go and do a master's or a degree, because that's just, it is just a green lumber fallacy. We often in degrees, as we all know, it's so theory based and not enough practical based. We are developing courses to put out in that way, and we've worked and delivered for our first NGB, and we're looking at delivering to more NGBs because we really want to make this stuff kind of sport specific. We worked with a target based sport NGB. Obviously, those principles won't apply to an invasion based sport. So we are looking at delivering and working with a lot more NGBs that coaches can come on these bite-sized courses as CPD, have a resource book, understand skill acquisition, understand inclusive practices, and then how to gamify those skills for their sport. That's something that we're building with multiple sports at the minute, and something that I think is completely missed, because people would have to go to uni for 3 or 4 years or do a master's for a year to have that very theory-based learning, where we're trying to condense it down to 1 day, couple-day course realistically. And I think it is achievable.
But do you know what I think? Do you know why I think what you do is really clever? Is because I don't think you're meeting the coaches at this completely alien space. You're actually starting from what coaches know most, which is games. Because we know games, like a coach plays games with players. So starting at that point and then showing them how they can tweak within something they're already doing, it's a far easier and a really accessible way of doing it. I mean, I've had personal experience of this, like where I try to help coaches integrate like psychosocial skills into their training and how they deliver with kids. If I just say to coaches, I do learn about mental imagery and all these other things, like that's bamboozling. That's a whole other field. That's not encouraging coaches to go and really take real ownership and take accountability for what they can do. But if I start at the point of saying, well, what are you already doing? Well, I give feedback, right? So you're already doing some stuff that can help with confidence. What are you saying? What are you already doing? You do practice sessions and it's passing. How can we make the practice sessions pressurizing in some way that helps it? So we're starting from a point of, it's almost like empowering coaches to do more of what they're already doing, not try to get them to go and do something different. And I think what you've captured here is really, really cool, because it's showing S&C isn't changing what they do. We don't need to outsource it. We actually can bring it in-house. We're already doing it. It's just how can we accentuate the things that we do that we don't maybe, or how do we at least bring that to the front of our mind? We are all doing movement skills, but would they be conscious of it? And you're bringing that into, is that correct? I feel like that's where you're getting at. That's cool.
I love that analogy that you said, because from that pressure standpoint, understanding what pressure is, you're not sending a coach on a 3-year psychology degree, right?
No.
It's that bare bones of that pracademic approach, backed up with some research, previous experiences, some references, but it's that, what can we do in the here and now? And that's what coaching is about. And you've hit the nail on the head. Like coaches, especially sports coaches, are going to be way more creative with the games that they're going to, we do these workshops with schools, and PE teachers come up with hundreds more games than we'd ever think of. And the kids even come up with more games. We just give that food for thought. We give the why and the how. They deliver the what,
Do you think would you say PE is quite a kind of potent space to get ideas for this sort of stuff? That it is true. I mean, I think when I teach students through sort of the TGFU stuff, teaching games for understanding, I mean, that was built out of PE, and there is often like bench ball and all these fun kind of morph games. They do often comes from that setting, don't they? So is that still applicable even with the movement aspect of things? You would say start dipping a little bit further into that space?
Yeah, I think some of the inspiration I've got off like teachers' forums and stuff like that, and thought, oh, that's a good game. How do I layer on a skill into that? It's how we learn, isn't it, through different things and how we interpret it. So I think it's very good from a game standpoint, a gamification standpoint, and then think, oh, how do I layer on the skill in that? What constraints can I put on the game or on certain players that might need it? But yeah, it's getting all these different sources of information, all these different experiences to really form that opinion and that structured piece.
And I think again about how we can do this at the same time because the hardest part of a coach's job is they need to fit in so many things at once. And I mean, what you can see difference. There's two sides. There's, at the one end of the spectrum, I see within youth sport, for example, I see like in my own sport, I see like academies taking kids separately to like movement parks and stuff like that, where there's big, big halls with all these stuff. They're doing parkour, and like in some sense, that's amazing because like they're understanding that movement capacity and how they're enriching that, or they get them to do judo and just they recognise that helps with other aspects of moving and being on the ground. But that coach that's got an hour that week, they're not getting other time. They can't think that way.
I agree. How do you microdose that within a warm up, for example, or how do you embed that in the session? Because in the judo example for like concussions and neck injuries, is that right? You might get some form of like a grappling kind of warm up before your session starts, right? When I've worked in contact sports, that's what we did. We'd have like a grappling warm up. Basically, you could embed that in your kind of warm up. I know the FIFA 11 warm up, really good from a rigor standpoint, but change it up. You might have some grappling element. You might have some partner work where they're like, pulling against each other or bracing against each other, or a tug of war kind of element or a grappling element. And then you've got your 50-minute session ahead. I really respect and appreciate what you're saying. Like if they're footballers, then footballers priority. It's like I worked in amateur football and they'd always do a boxing camp in pre-season. And there was like, for goodness sake, like we can be more creative and create this environment on the pitch, And it was rigor. They would always give a rigor for boxing as fitness and collaboration and, social side. I was like, well, we can create that in a really good football setting and a good coaching session on the pitch. We can get the physical side in no trouble. We can create game-based, pressure situations within that. It's almost that culture change, realistically, and that education piece which needs to be done.
I completely love what you're trying to do, Rob. I think it's really fresh. It's very accessible. I want to give you an opportunity as well. How can we plug in? Give us some stuff. Where can we find out more about your company? Also, I think if you could be really generous, what are some other additional resources that you think that sports coach out there who wants to learn how they can help their athletes move better so they can perform better and be more skillful? Tell us some stuff. Where would they maybe be helped by going to if it isn't just your own website? Do you know any of other stuff that helps you a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, most of the stuff I pulled off my own kind of experiences realistically and put into this. I think, like I said, there's PE resources, but it's understanding like the skill acquisition. Like there's lots of good, Google, just typing on Google, like PE packs, PE resources. There'll be lots of like skill-based games which will come up on there. Formal courses, I'm not sure. That's why I kind of,
that's where you come in. That's where you come in. So, so we know that. So tell us about your company.
That's why I thought when we kind of discussed this, I thought I'll ask the open question because I know the Scottish FA is very different to the English FA. And I thought, maybe there is like a skill acquisition course or something in there because that's ultimately the gap we're going to fill and are trying to fill. We fill it from an inclusive standpoint. But as a byproduct of that, it's also all the other added bonuses within that. We are looking at developing courses with more national governing bodies. So yeah, it could be something in the future for sure.
Yeah. And do you have so there's a website, isn't there, as well for Movement Mojo? And is that a good place to direct people to? Is there some stuff on that? Or how could they get in touch with you if they were wanting to maybe use your services? Yeah,
definitely. So movemojo.com is the website. Like I was saying, it's really from a disability community standpoint where we originally came from and still come from as a concept. But like I was saying, we are now, as any startup, expanding, finding bigger problems to solve, more problems. And this is one of them which we are solving at the minute. So the website is very much like our philosophies around inclusion in gamification and skill acquisition for community and populations with disabilities. If you want to reach out, LinkedIn, Rob Francis on LinkedIn. I'm always open for a conversation to see how we can help. And then also just catch up and discuss things like this because it is a massive interest of mine and I'm always there to try and learn too.
Yeah. No, no, thanks. Thank you so much, Rob. And what I will do as well, for those that are listening, I'll put some of Rob's details in the sort of show notes as well, so maybe it's a bit easier for people to find you. Would be really good. So if I can attempt, I suppose, to cover some of the things we've done in summary, which will be quite, this is difficult, but in a good way. I suppose we've made the distinction now between a still first and a movement first approach within sessions. What we've actually also sort of came to realise is that they aren't worlds apart. It's just what's salient more than the other at any one time. And again, it's not actually, I don't think this is a conversation that's to try and convince coaches to get rid of still learning, because it isn't. But we have to recognise, maybe almost in a diagnostic way, when there's a problem in still learning and still execution, have you considered the movement that underpins that? And have you maybe developed a plan for how you can enhance the movement going forward? So, in a way that's complementary to your coaching, doesn't take away from the art of sport coaching or still learning. It actually is just showing how it can be reinforced and improved through the S&C view on things. We're starting to also sort of figure out that we need to tear down the boundaries, I suppose, of outsourcing work to other people. I think, as I say, going to that, free staff, 1 hour each, it should be 3 hours of work each to each person, 3 hours of influence to each person. So what can we do to concurrently target things? And importantly, I think what we've got to, Rob, is we're showing how we can microdose. We can get more out of less time. We can do more, and this game-based approach is really helpful for that. Not just because it's useful for movement, but actually how is it useful for that? We're taking a wider view on physical literacy here. We're starting to consider confidence, motivation, these sorts of things that come into it. These sorts of things that will change and go up and down as the player evolves, as the person ages, how that has an influence. And we've came back to the Andy Murray case study. We've came back to how mechanics of movement change, how we need to think still first for so long, then it becomes movement first. And the coach's job is to evolve with that. And I suppose that's where we landed on this idea of individualization. We need to care more about that, have an individualized approach to learning, whether it be through still, whether it be through movement, probably both, but it's again, what's the order of that and how does that move and change? So hopefully I've not butchered that. I probably have. It's
love it. I love it.
That's exactly all right.
It. Yeah.
No,
yeah,
right.
I love
okay,
it.
Good. I'll give it a go. Right, well done. No, thanks Rob, so much. I hope and I absolutely assume that for those that are listening, that was as helpful for you as it was for myself. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Rob.
Thanks for having me. Cheers. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, guys. See you next time, everyone.